This is the year two macro specimen paper. The reason I picked this, because I know I just said it's quite easy, is not because it's easy. It's because it covers basically so many policies. I think pretty much every essay is a policy question, which I don't think has ever happened in an actual paper. And again, it kind of shows what I mean in that people quite like policies questions a lot of the time, especially demand and supply side. So here we go. Using the data in the extracts and your economic knowledge, evaluate the view that the use of protectionism is inevitably damaging to economies. So I'm gonna again be very kind of quick here. Oh, sorry, someone's in the waiting room. Thank you, dear. So I'm going to be very quick here in how I explain what protectionism is. But again, this is to help apply what we just went through, the classification of policies and how you use that for different questions. So this is protectionism. This is more like the advanced second year macro stuff. Not really going to talk about supply demand side policies here. The key policies for protectionism are tariffs, subsidies, export subsidies typically, regulation of imports and quotas. And to be honest, I'm never going to talk about quotas or regulations unless the question makes me. So the key things I'm going to talk about are tariffs and export subsidies. I'm not going to use ADAS diagrams actually because tariffs and export subsidies have their own diagrams. Although I might link them to ADAS diagrams. For example, I might do something like, so we've been told, evaluate the view that the use of protectionism is damaging to economies. So I might say a tariff. Okay, what is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports. So tariff leads to more expensive imports because you're taxing the imports. The government is saying to the producers, you basically have to pay money to import in this country. So they're going to put the price up. So price of imports up. And then if I think, how might that affect domestic firms, say in somewhere like the UK? Well, firms in the UK, they might import a lot of raw materials from where it's cheaper. So this is going to increase the cost of production for firms, say in the UK, cost increases for firms. In the chat, someone, what happens to aggregate supply? Very easy. Cost increases for firms. What happens to aggregate supply? Should have 25 answers. Bam, bam, bam. Yes. Good, Drew. Good, Miati. Fingers on the trigger. All right. Aggregate supply down. And then GDP down. That's damaging. That's answering the question right there. GDP down. That is contrary to one of our macro objectives. Inflation up. Oh no, inflation's already like 6%. Oh, this is not good. Inflation up, damaging macroeconomic objective of 2 to 3% inflation, probably not going to be met. So very easy, right? And the point I'm making here is I'm not talking about this as a supply side policy. It's when I'm doing a protectionism essay, there is no need for me to talk about tariffs as a supply side policy. And by the way, tariffs will also have demand side impacts. So again, there's this confusing classification issue. I'm kind of saying it's not a problem. I don't have to talk about it. I'm not forced to do it at all. The focus I have is tariffs as a form of protectionism and an impact tariffs might have. I am using ADAS mechanics, but that's not the same thing as calling this a supply demand side policy. I'm just saying it will impact AS in a way that will negatively impact the objectives, and therefore protectionism is damaging. And then I could evaluate this by saying, well, it depends on the country in question. So for the UK, it might be damaging because we import a lot of raw materials. But for a country that doesn't rely on imports as much in production, it might not be as damaging. So yeah, we've got essentially a point here. We could use ASAD mechanics, but there's no need for us to worry about classifying this as a demand or supply side policy because protectionism is one of these advanced policy topics where you don't really have to do that. Okay, hopefully this is making sense now. Like hopefully you're going, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I can use aggregate supply, aggregate demand, but I don't really have to worry about, oh, is it demand side or supply side? Um, so okay, let's have a look at our next essay then. So oh, oh, yeah, again, specimen paper. It's just a bit too kind, but it is a really good paper for practicing like basic essays. Let's put it this way: if this essay comes up in the exam, you want to be doing this essay. By and large, it's very difficult for me to imagine this not being the essay of choice for the majority of students. Um, and so this is just a great paper to practice like good essays in case they do come up, so that you already practice something easy if it does come up. So is asking us how effective monetary policy, so we've got specifically interest rates and QE/QT, is in achieving macro stability. Now, the only problem we have here, the only thing which makes this not super easy, is the phrase macro stability. If they'd have said achieving growth or reducing unemployment or controlling inflation, no problem. That specificity would make it so easy. But by giving us this kind of vague-ish phrase, which is classic AQA, they are adding a bit of a curveball here. But I think macroeconomic stability is a very easy thing to address. You could address this in a very easy way, a very advanced way. Stable rate of inflation, or close to target inflation. That's a very easy way to think about macroeconomic stability. And you could even argue, say in your introduction, that the reason the inflation target is to have relatively stable inflation is because that creates the conditions for stable growth and stable employment. So just by controlling inflation, which is also effectively the primary focus of the central bank in the first place, you could argue that controlling inflation is really fundamental to macro stability. You could talk about preventing booms and recessions. I think a lot of students will focus maybe on preventing recessions in terms of macro stability, which isn't wrong. But if you think about what stability really means, it would also be preventing like a big inflationary boom, even though that would be really good for growth and employment. You would want to keep things more stable, not rising too fast or falling, basically. Um, so okay, we would. Hmm, I think I'd want to use the extract heavily here and see what policies are actually taking place. Speculation of interest rate rises. So that's probably going to be a very easy point to talk about here, because interest rate rises will make borrowing more expensive and saving more rewarding, which is going to decrease aggregate demand. So this is a contractionary monetary policy to decrease aggregate demand. That will reduce price levels and help control inflation. So that's that, just that. I'd want to use the extract a lot more than just this quote, of course, but that's given me an idea of how I might approach this, right? Because again, it doesn't really specify, do we want to increase inflation, decrease inflation, increase growth, decrease growth? So I'm probably going to take my cues from the extract and explain that increasing interest rates will help stabilize the price level, keep us close to target inflation, and that will encourage greater overall macroeconomic stability. Um, Criticism of the UK's quantitative easing program. So obviously, if we've done interest rates, the only other option in monetary policy is QE or QT. And I might, if I want to be really sort of ambitious here, what I would personally do is I would explain both. If the extract talks about QE, I'm going to use my quotes for QE, but I would explain both. And I'd try and explain it sort of in the way that at any given point, there is probably an ideal amount of spending in the economy in order to preserve macroeconomic stability. And the point of QE and QT is it's kind of like a money tap and a money plug. So if you imagine like a bathtub, right? You've got the tap at the top, and if you turn the tap on, you get more water in the bath. And then you've got the plug at the bottom, and if you pull the plug out, you've got less water in the bath. And there's like an ideal amount of water in the bath for you to have a stable bath, let's say. And the QE is like the tap. QE, you turn the tap on, more money in the bath, more money supply, more water in the bath. And then QT is like pulling out the plug, right? Taking water out of the system. So I would try and explain it in that way, not using a bath analogy, just to be clear. But the logic, I would try and explain the logic of the bath analogy without using the bath analogy, if that makes sense. That would be it is an actual analogy from like economics books, but I don't know. I don't know if they would see it as a bit too out there. Anyway. So okay. I think this one again fairly straightforward as long as we have a good way of dealing with this term, macro stability. All right. Any questions? Stick them in the chat. We're doing quite good for time, so I don't mind answering a couple because I wanted to kind of have a look at all of these today. But again, we're good for time. So we've had a monetary policy one, we've had a protectionism one. You can see question 10, the first section of the essay. We've got supply side policies and unemployment. And you might be thinking, oh, that looks very nice, but I'll come to why there's a bit of a slight difficulty again there, not a huge one, but a slight one. Question 12 is kind of a fiscal policy essay. So you've had monetary supply side fiscal policy. Again, this is just a great paper to sort of practice these, or even just look at like if you don't have time to practice or there's too much effort for you. Mark schemes. Look at the mark schemes. See what are the kind of common stuff they're expecting for all your major policies in one paper's mark scheme. Useful. So this second 25 marker question 12 is more about fiscal policy. Deficit reduction, that refers to the government deficit, which is when government spending is greater than taxes. So deficit reduction basically involves either increasing taxes or lower government spending. And as it says here, lower government spending. We're basically here evaluating whether contractionary fiscal policy is undesirable and unnecessary. That's what lower government spending will do. So we're looking effectively at some of the downsides of contractionary fiscal policy versus the upsides. And then lastly, we have a development essay. So that's another one of the maybe more advanced policy essays. So okay, let's go through some of these, which I think are a bit quicker. So question 10. So it might be like, oh, this one's lovely because it's just supply side policies, and you got some really easy stuff there, like government spending on education and spending on R&D. And it's not like the macro stability one we just had. We've got a very clear target here. Instead of the wishy-washy concept of macro stability, just is supply side policy the best at reducing unemployment? So I think there is something quite interesting here, and I feel like if you know this, you will write a much better unemployment essay or this kind of essay versus if you don't know this. I'll try and keep it pretty simple. Demand side policy, where am I going to put this? I'll put it down here. Demand side policy deals best with cyclical unemployment. I'm not going to write unemployment because I'm having a bit of a difficult time even writing cyclical. This is cyclical. Okay. You're just going to have to trust me. It says cyclical. Anyway, and supply side affects structural or is very good at reducing structural. So you've also got seasonal and frictional. Frictional, relatively minor in a lot of cases, and can be quite difficult to remove. Seasonal, again, also difficult because you can't really change the seasons. Like I don't know if there's any government yet in the world who are able to make winter less cold. Chinese probably working on it, but anyway. So I'd kind of focus on it as these are the two main kinds of unemployment you can talk about, and a very simple way of addressing it. And hopefully you can see that this really is fundamental to the question. It's going to give you a really good way to answer this question. Effectively, if you've got supply structural unemployment, supply side is best. If you've got cyclical unemployment, supply side is not the best. So the real question would be: is UK unemployment structural or cyclical? Mira, great question. Is cyclical unemployment due to lack of demand for labor? Yes, exactly, which is why cyclical unemployment is solved by demand side policies, because cyclical unemployment is fundamentally about a lack of aggregate demand in the economy and therefore a lack of derived demand for labor, right? All demand for labor comes from the demand for goods and services. So if aggregate demand is low, derived demand for labor is low or relatively low. So yes, it is a really good question, and that's exactly how you should think of it, because the whole point is if the lack of employment is caused by a lack of demand for labor, if you increase demand in the economy, you can increase demand for labor. So that's hopefully going to help you see a really big point for this essay is that cyclical unemployment, such as that caused by the financial crisis, which is referenced in the STEM. 2012 output was still below its peak of 2008 here, so there still hasn't been a recovery from the financial crisis. So that could indicate cyclical unemployment, which would indicate that demand side policies might provide a better result than supply side policies. With structural, on the other hand, if you think about structural as sort of a mismatch between the skills of the labor force and the demand for labor by firms, you can easily see why a supply side policy like education or training programs or subsidies for training programs might help reduce structural unemployment. For example, if you give people who don't have current relevant market skills like IT skills or computing skills or coding skills, then you can resolve structural unemployment. So this way I would usually divide this kind of question, and I think if you don't address this, I do personally think if you don't address this somehow or somewhere in your essay, I do personally think it's hard to get as good an essay as someone who does address it, assuming all other factors are constant, like your application is just as good and your grammar is just as good and all of this kind of thing. But yeah, for unemployment essays, this is something always consider, right? For policies to reduce unemployment, well, maybe we should think that the type of policy should be matched to the type of unemployment. It's not just as simple as saying, oh, this policy is always the best for unemployment, or this policy is always the best for unemployment. So okay, hopefully that makes a lot of sense. As usual, questions in the chat for this next one, question 12. So we already spoke a bit about this one, kind of got carried away earlier. I think I'll talk a bit more though, maybe about specific points, as again we're not bad for time. So again, we're basically being asked: is the government lowering spending, which is a type of fiscal policy, unnecessary and undesirable? I don't need to focus too much on the actual fiscal policy aspect here, though. Really, my focus is on these two words. So reducing deficit through lower spending, that's kind of my core concept. And I'm being asked, is that lowering of spending to reduce the deficit unnecessary and undesirable. And this, I think, lends itself very well to a two-point structure. I'd first explain why it might be unnecessary or necessary, and then why it might be undesirable or desirable. The undesirable side is very, very easy. Lower government spending, lower AD, lower growth, lower unemployment. If you want to get really advanced, you could actually say, okay, hear me out here. Lower AD, lower income, lower GDP, and that means lower future tax revenue. I'm just going to put FT for future tax revenue as the economy weakens, and that's actually going to mean higher future budget deficit, which is the whole thing you're trying to solve. And this is a very nice general argument for the idea that you can deal with government debt or a deficit by lowering spending. Is basically the government pays off its debt through the economy's income, right? So if you try and deal with debt by lowering the economy's income, you might have a bit of a problem because you're now going to have less income to pay off the remaining debt. So it could backfire, basically. Undesirable. It's going to decrease GDP, decrease growth in employment, and possibly make the deficit even worse in the future. And then for unnecessary, this is a really interesting one. Now, you might not do this again until later. It's often the case that when students do fiscal policy, they do like basic and advanced fiscal policy at different points in the course. One of the key topics in advanced fiscal policy is whether government debt is actually a problem. A bit like we've spoken about, is the current account deficit actually a problem? You could do the same thing for the government budget. Is the budget deficit actually a problem? Is national debt actually a problem? And I think that's where we should go here, right? Because if national debt isn't really a problem for the UK, then trying to reduce the deficit isn't really necessary. Trying to overall decrease the amount that's added to debt isn't necessary if the debt itself isn't a problem. So things we could say here, we could talk about the UK being a safe haven economy, which comes with some nice evals and AO2. And this might get a bit complicated, but again, this is why I said like this is a more advanced fiscal policy topic. But basically, because we are a safe haven economy, our government doesn't have to charge very high interest rates on, doesn't have to give very high interest rates on its government bonds compared to other economies. So the fact that we can have relatively low interest rate on government bonds compared to other similar economies, much like America, but to a lesser extent, means we can continuously borrow in international financial markets at cheap rates. And then a potential evaluation for this for the modern era would be, with everything that's happened in the UK over the past 5 years, the idea of the UK as a safe haven country is becoming less tenable. So then you could also talk about whether the deficit is too high as a proportion of GDP. That's always the key question when it comes to whether your national debt or deficit is actually a problem, is how high is it compared to the money you make? Like if I told you I know someone who is £1 million in debt, they literally they owe, no, let's make it bigger, £10 million. They owe £10 million in debt. You would probably say, oh my God, that's so much debt. How is that person ever going to pay it off? They must be going through hell right now. But what if I said that person's also Elon Musk? Then you would go, oh, well, for Elon Musk, £10 million of debt, no problem. He earns so much money that he can pay off his debt without a problem. So it's not the absolute value of debt is basically not important. It's the relative value of debt. And you could point out here, for example, that I think Japan's debt to GDP ratio is you have to check the exact figures, but I think is about 3 times larger than the UK. So relative to its income, Japan has 3 times more debt than the UK. and that's been the way for I think like 20 years, 20 a long time. So clearly, or we could argue that Japan demonstrates that given that it hasn't had a debt crisis itself, the UK probably isn't near a true debt crisis. Give Liz Truss another 6 months in government, and you know what? Maybe that'll change. But okay. Let's have a look at this last question then. Again, any questions, put them in the chat. Otherwise, let me clear this up. So this is a development question. And firstly, can someone tell me, let's make sure some of us are paying attention, what what is my stance on talking about demand and supply side policies for this kind of question? Development policies. Do I need to talk about demand and supply side policies here, regardless of the rest of the question, just on the basis that it's a development question? It is a policies question. Do I need to get into like different demand and supply side policies? Yes or no? So there's been a lot going on, but hopefully this isn't too difficult a question. Given my breakdown earlier of how we deal with the more advanced policy questions, do I need to categorize? Mira says no. Mira is correct. We do not. Yes, for these topics. Hopefully, you can still see the board. For these topics, we're under no onus, no pressure to categorize this in terms of demand and supply side policies, and we can approach this as almost a separate topic. However, we can still use a DAS analysis. So notice that the specific policies we're asked about here is comparing free trade and aid for economic development. Now, economic development, what makes that different from growth, in case you don't do geography, is it's basically broader, trying to capture more indicators of living standards. So economic development, often to measure economic development, for example, we'll look at things like health and education, as well as just income, or you might look at equality, or you might look at the environment. So economic development is like a much broader concept than economic growth. Economic growth is just about income and how people's living standards are increasing or decreasing measured by income. Economic development, easiest way to think about it is also health and education. But again, you can go even broader still. So what we basically want to talk about here is what is going to allow a developing country such as Ethiopia to improve variables like income, health, and education better. Is it free trade or is it aid from other countries? So with free trade, for example, I think we would talk about how free trade encourages competition, competition encourages efficiency. I could link that to aggregate supply. I could say if Ethiopia submit to free trade, their firms will face more competition, they'll have to get more productive, their aggregate supply will increase, and then that's going to lead to economic growth. And then they can use that economic growth to spend on hospitals and schools. So overall, free trade could increase economic development because it can increase their income, and then they can use that to spend on health and education. Boom, economic development, very nice and easy. And then I might evaluate that. A classic evaluation of free trade with developing countries is that they can't compete effectively with the firms in developed economies. And in fact, pretty much every rich country, Harjin Chang, one of my favorite macroeconomists, really good at pointing this out. Every rich country used protectionism to get started. Basically, America, 19th century, the UK basically like invented protectionism, and we were highly protectionist at various points of great economic success as well. So it kind of makes sense that for countries that are still developing their industries, they shouldn't submit to free trade. They should protect those developing industries until they're strong enough to compete with multinational Western firms. This is a really, really good argument. Different names for the argument: strategic trade, the infant industries argument, but basically, free trade doesn't make sense for countries that have undeveloped industries. So America, great example historically, because if you think about what happened when America was colonized by Europeans, the Europeans are kind of trying to build a modern economy from scratch, right? So they've come from England, Spain, France, Germany, Ireland, whatever. And these are some of the most advanced economies in the world at that point, and they're settling in America, taking it over, and then trying to build that thing from scratch. So in like the 18th century, all American industry was emerging. No American industry had hundreds of years of history or experience. Every single American industry was basically a growing, developing industry, and they protected them. They protected them from free trade so that they could grow without competition. And then, when you have big, powerful, efficient companies, then you can have free trade with other countries. That's the idea, anyway. So then aid as well, aid very easy. Again, I am not going to categorize this as a demand or supply side policy. If I do here, actually, if I try, I could end up just running around in circles because aid could be spent on anything. It could be spent on education. Oh, demand side, supply side policy. It could be spent on I'm just building, or let's say building something that doesn't necessarily contribute to supply. I don't know, building more civil what's the word, civil servant departments or something. Maybe that would indirectly increase the supply of products, but you could have basically aid could impact loads of aggregate demand in lots of ways. It could impact aggregate supply in lots of ways. So again, I'm not going to touch that. This is not a specifically supply, demand, fiscal, monetary essay, so there's no need for me to go there at all. I am probably going to bring in ADAS mechanics again. I might talk about how aids can be used to provide health services in particular, which are health issues are very constraining, provide a big barrier for developing countries because if you have really poor health services and health conditions, you have loads of people either not working much because they're taking sick days off or they can't work or whatever, or working but very unproductively. So we could argue that if aid can be used to very quickly get medicines or things like this that the country is lacking, and that can increase productivity. And then that comes with easy evaluations, like aid doesn't encourage self sufficiency. It can encourage countries to become reliant basically on transfers, handouts from other countries rather than developing their own industries or their own healthcare industry. And then another common criticism of aid is it cannot be provided at scale enough to actually like develop a healthcare industry in Ethiopia. You can kind of metaphorically slash literally just provide a sticking plaster, right? There's terrible healthcare in the country. You can provide medicines, and medicines will alleviate the symptoms, but they'll just be a short-term fix. If there isn't like hospitals and there isn't good health education and hygiene standards and this kind of thing, you aren't going to fix the problem just through aid. So again, hopefully you can see like the main thing here, because you haven't done these topics, is not for you to master development policies, of which there are many in one lesson, is to see what I'm saying about applying either the basic or advanced macro policies topics, right? Like we can see with this unemployment one, I'm really just the way I planned that, or the way I thought about that, is really just using these macroeconomic basics: aggregate demand, aggregate supply, types of unemployment, how does certain types of policies that are classified as supply demand side affect types of unemployment. But then for the development essay, for the protectionism essay we had earlier up here, Again, I've used ADAS to make my arguments to help me talk about what is damaging to economies, for example, here. I've used ADAS. And when we talked about how trade and aid can promote development, I also talked about ADAS somewhere in there, but no classification, no need to get into that discussion of whether it's demand or supply side here. And it goes back to what we were saying, earlier about the overlap between policies. I think the policies topic is very straightforward, except for the overlap between demand and supply and fiscal and supply side and development and protectionism and demand and supply side. But like I said right at the start, at times you can choose to ignore that. If you want to be really advanced, you can get into like how all these things overlap and how that affects our conclusions for questions. Um, but sometimes it's not necessary. And I think for things like development, protectionism, financial markets, it can actually be unhelpful. Like we said with aid, you could spend ages just trying to work out, wait, is this a supply side policy, a demand side policy? Can I be sure? Is it one or the other? Is it both? Whereas a student with a simpler approach is just going to ignore that. I'm just going to be like, right, aid. How does that improve economic development? Who cares whether it's supply or demand side policy? How does it improve development?